Hello and welcome to the Daily News Simplified, the what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we'll be analyzing the Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 18th January 2019. The topics to be discussed today are reflected on your screen and the timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. So let's begin. This article is an editorial taken from page number 8 and is in the context of the Annual Status of Education report which was recently released by the NGO Pratham. From a syllabus perspective, it will form a part of a GS paper 2 under the category of issues relating to education. Now this Annual Status of Education report, which is released annually by the NGO Pratham ever since the year of 2005, in this year's report has basically stated that there hasn't been much improvement from the previous years. The findings of this ASCR has been discussed thoroughly by Naved sir in yesterday's video, so we will not delve much into what were the findings of this report, but would rather look at the suggestions which the author in this editorial is putting forward. The ASCR 2018 basically highlighted two things. Firstly, that the basic learning and reading amongst children of 5th standard has shown a downward trend from the previous years. Secondly, even in the arithmetic skills, which though have been showing a continuous downward trend, but since 2016, there has been some kind of improvement. Therefore, in the backdrop of the findings of the Annual Status of Education Report 2018, the author is putting forth certain suggestions so as to improve the status of education in India, especially in the rural areas. In the first suggestion, the author is saying, now that the government has proper data in the form of Annual Status of Education Report for the past 10 years, the central government should now start a review mechanism for education in our country. This review mechanism should be carried out in all states for all government as well as private schools, especially for the elementary level. Elementary education includes classes from 1st to 8th standard. So as per the author, the first step should be review the entire education process in our country. Secondly, the author suggests that the government should begin a public consultation under which the government should actually ask the general public about their opinions on activity-based learning as well as what according to them was the shortfall that they faced during their early education. So what the author is implying is that if we can ask the general public about what are their opinions on the outcomes of an activity-based learning rather than the traditional and conventional rote learning which is taught in our schools these days, and secondly, if we could ask them what according to them was lacking or was deficient during their early education, then too we can use all these suggestions to improve our education system. Thirdly, the author says the Right to Education Act has been a very welcome step because as per the ASCR 2018, the enrollment rate in our country has gone up to 96%. But what the author feels is just the quantity, that is the number of children who are enrolling in the school is not enough, but we rather have to look at the quality of education which is being imparted in our schools. Thus, the author suggests that a supporting framework for the Right to Education Act has to be evolved so that the quality of education which is being imparted in our country can be improved. Therefore, the focus should be both on quantity as well as quality. Fourthly, the author says that India at times becomes too ambitious or starts to keep unrealistic expectations from school-going children as far as academics is concerned. Parents and society usually would expect their child to become some kind of prodigy as far as numeracy, science or general literacy is concerned. Therefore, the author feels that this mindset has to be changed and there should be some kind of reform in curricular expectations because such kind of expectations only put additional burden on a child which again acts like a demotivating factor and rather becomes a hurdle in their education. Lastly, the author says that we should learn from the examples of other states who have come out with a lot of innovative techniques to improve the school education system. For example, in Andhra Pradesh, the government started to incentivize teachers and this has led to better outcomes, especially in the area of maths and languages. So thus incentivizing teachers or paying them better could be one kind of innovation which other states too can implement. So finally, in conclusion, the author in this article is saying that multiple kind of approaches can be taken up in order to bring out certain kind of reform in our education system, especially as far as elementary school education is concerned. Based on a discussion, please try and attempt this mains practice question. With this, let's move on to our next article. This next article appears on page number 8 and is the lead editorial which talks about the collegium controversy. From a syllabus perspective, it will form a part of GS paper 2 under the structure and functioning of the judiciary as well as under the topic of separation of powers between various organs. This editorial basically highlights a controversial decision taken by the Collegium to elevate 2 judges to the Supreme Court of India by revoking a decision taken by the previous Collegium. So the author in this editorial says that the decision of the Collegium to revoke an earlier decision of the previous Collegium has brought the system of judicial elevation in our country under scrutiny. So in this aspect, let us understand what exactly happened. Now this is how the facts of this situation actually unfold. In December 2018, the Collegium, comprising of the Chief Justice of India and other 4 senior-most judges, met on 12th December 2018 to consider and recommend names of judges for the appointment in the Supreme Court. However, this required consultation could not be undertaken, that is, this required consultation could not be completed because the winter vacation of the court had started. And then, when the court reopened after the winter vacation break, the composition of this collegium had changed because one of the judges had retired. Then in January 2019, a newly constituted collegium decided to take a fresh look into this matter. And this collegium, that is the January 2019 collegium, took different decision than the previous December 2018 collegium because they decided to elevate some other judges who were not earlier considered by this December 2018 collegium. Now, due to all these factors, the collegium system has again been brought into controversy. The author in his article has put forth basically 5 points regarding this controversy. First is the arbitrarily revoking of decisions taken by the previous collegium, leading to a question: can a collegium arbitrarily revoke or change the decisions taken by a previous collegium? The second question which this controversy has opened up is that can retirement of one judge be a ground to withdraw an earlier decision of the collegium? So in the December 2018 collegium, though the entire consultation process was not over, but as far as what is available on the Supreme Court website, certain decision was taken with respect to which judges would be elevated. But then in January, composition changed. The names of the judges who are now being elevated are different. So the question which the author puts is that can the retirement of one judge be a ground to withdraw the earlier decision of the collegium and then take a new decision altogether? The third issue is with regards to seniority of judges, as in this case, more senior judges were not elevated. That is, certain judges were superseded and other judges who had lesser seniority have now been elevated over them. Hence, the issue of seniority of judges has again been brought into the limelight. Fourthly, the author says that the grounds or the parameters to choose a more deserving or a suitable candidate in all respects to be appointed as a judge of the Supreme Court is not clear. That is, what parameters or what grounds or what consideration does the collegium make so as to ensure that a person who is actually deserving and is the most suitable candidate is only selected is again not clear, and hence leaves a lot of room for doubtful decision making by the collegium. Fifth point again is a similar one, which says that the grounds to bypass seniority again is not very clear, which can lead to arbitrary or doubtful decision making by the collegium. Hence, in totality, these certain grounds have again brought into limelight the credibility of the collegium system in our country. Now, in the year 2017, in your GS paper 2, a question has been directly asked on the National Judicial Appointment Commission Act of 2014, in which it is asking the reasons why the Supreme Court had struck down this act. So in this context, we'll understand what the National Judicial Appointment Commission was and why it was held as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Before the NJAC, there was a system of collegium in our country, as per which the Chief Justice of India and a forum of other 4 senior-most judges of the Supreme Court would recommend names for the appointment and the transfer of judges of the higher judiciary. The National Judicial Appointment Commission was brought in to change the procedure of judicial appointment and transfer of judges of the High Courts and the Supreme Courts of India. Thus, the NJAC wanted to replace the existing collegium system in our country. As per the NJAC Act, the National Judicial Appointment Commission consisted of number 1, the Chief Justice of India, who was to act as the ex officio chairman of the commission. Secondly, it comprised of 2 other senior-most judges of the Supreme Court after the Chief Justice of India, who were again the ex officio members of this commission. Thirdly, the Union Law Minister too was the part of this commission. And lastly, this commission had to have two eminent persons on its panel who were to be nominated by a committee comprising of the Prime Minister, the Chief Justice of India, and the Leader of Opposition in Lok Sabha. Hence, through the National Judicial Appointment Commission, the executive tried to become part of the appointment process of the judiciary. As you can see, the Union Law Minister is an executive. Further, even these two eminent persons who are to be appointed would be nominated by the Prime Minister and the Leader of Opposition, who are again the part of the executive. Now, the Supreme Court of India had held the National Judicial Appointment Commission as unconstitutional. Let us look at the reasons why NJAC was held unconstitutional. As per the Supreme Court, preserving the primacy of judiciary in the appointment process is of the utmost importance, and the various changes to the appointment process were not enough or were not adequate to preserve this primacy. Secondly, the inclusion of the Law Minister in the Commission was a direct infringement on the independence of judiciary as well as the principle of separation of power between the judiciary and executive as is stipulated under Article 50. Now, if the Law Minister, who is a part of the executive, becomes a member of the commission, then in a way the executive is finding its way into the appointment process, thereby diluting Article 50, which clearly says that the state shall take steps to separate the judiciary from the executive. Further, having an executive member on the commission would tamper with the independence of judiciary. And both independence of judiciary and separation of power are one of the most basic features of our Indian Constitution. Hence, under no circumstances can both of these principles be diluted. Further, under the NJAC Act, the executive wanted to bring in two eminent persons into the voting process who would further have veto powers. Hence, NJAC gave veto powers to these eminent persons, but these eminent persons were again to be nominated by a committee which would have Prime Minister and the Leader of Opposition as the executive members, thereby indirectly again bringing in the executive in the appointment process, which led to a greater say of the executive in the judiciary of our country. Thus, the Supreme Court decided that the Constitution 121st Amendment Act is unconstitutional due to the interference of executive and diluting the provision of the separation of judiciary from the executive. Thus, in conclusion, this decision of the Supreme Court has in a way again revived the collegiate system, at least as for now. Now, though a question has already been asked on this National Judicial Appointment Commission, but you should know all these details because the NJAC becomes very important if you look at the larger picture of the collegium system and the general judicial appointment in our country. With this, let's move on to our next article. This news is the lead article taken from page number 8 and is in the context of the United Nations withdrawal of its troops from Afghanistan. From its syllabus, it will form a part of GS Paper 2 in the category of International Relations under the subtopic of Effect of Policies of Developed Countries on India's Interest as well as India and its Neighbourhood Relationship. In this article, the author basically highlights that the US-Afghan policy has failed poorly because despite heavy economic spending by the United States of America and Afghanistan, no substantial returns have been produced. Now, as per the author, currently the United States of America spends more than $45 billion a year in Afghanistan, including the $5 billion for the Afghan security forces. Yet, despite such heavy economic spending, the author says that Taliban in Afghanistan is continuously increasing in strength. Further, Al-Qaeda, which has though now weakened, but it still exists in Afghanistan. Apart from this, various other terrorist organizations such as the Haqqani network is continuing to gain strength in Afghanistan. Apart from all this, United States of America has even been unable to control the production of poppy, which is one of the major sources of finance for the Taliban. Similarly, the author says that the Afghanistan government continues to remain weak as there is lack of institutions of legislature, judiciary and civil society. And this lack of government institution has led to Taliban establishing a parallel government in almost 40% areas of Afghanistan. Lastly, the author says that the Afghan security forces are suffering unacceptable casualties with almost 30,000 casualties occurring since 2015. And this has led to less recruitment in the Afghan forces, where now the current Afghan security forces are down by more than 10% from their sanctioned strength. That is, there has been a considerable reduction in the Afghanistan military forces' strength. Moving ahead, in this article, the author talks about the prospective USA escape plan from Afghanistan. That is, this is what the author feels what the United States of America will do in future so as to withdraw from Afghanistan. Hence, whatever the author is mentioning next is all based on conjectures. The first thing which the author feels that the United States of America would do is that it will push for a new version of the 2011 Bonn Conference so that it can set up an interim government which can plan the Loya Jirga. We will come to Loya Jirga later. Let us first understand about the 2011 Bonn Conference. Now, what had happened that USA, after defeating Taliban, signed the Bonn Agreement in 2001. As per this agreement, it intended to recreate the state of Afghanistan and called for the Loya Jirga to be convened, which would discuss the formation of the constitution of Afghanistan as well as provide for transitional government in Afghanistan. Therefore, as per this agreement, the USA wanted to convene the Loya Jirga, which is like an assembly of the elders, so that they can come together and form a constitution for the state of Afghanistan as well as also provide for a transitional government until the next proper elections can be held in Afghanistan. Now, as per the author, under the new version of this Bonn Conference, what would be different is that this time it would see a greater participation from countries like Russia, China, as well as participation of Taliban itself, who were missing in the earlier Bonn Conference. Therefore, this conference will allow the USA to form a scenario where regional powers like Russia and China can engage themselves in the narrative of Afghanistan. Additionally, the author feels that the inclusion of Taliban in this new version of Bonn Conference will provide Taliban with legitimacy in Afghanistan politics and thus will pave a way for the USA to withdraw from Afghanistan. Let us now look at what Loya Jirga is all about. Loya Jirga is like a grand assembly comprising of elders and tribal chiefs, which is mostly very favored and popular amongst the Pashtun people and to a lesser extent by other nearby groups in Afghanistan region as well. Now, this Loya Jirga predates the modern day written and fixed laws. That is, this Loya Jirga existed before the modern day fixed or written laws were actually established. Hence, Loya Jirgas have been reportedly organized since the Kushan Empire under the Kanishka in the history of Afghanistan. Loya Jirga is somewhat similar to the concept of a sabha which is prevalent in the Indian subcontinent. Thus, under this Bonn Conference, the USA wanted to convene this grand assembly of elders and tribal chiefs and then make the constitution for the state of Afghanistan and would decide as to how the next transitional government has to be established. So therefore, from the perspective of UPSC, this Loya Jirga and this Bonn Conference become very important from the prelims as they relate to the current events of international importance. Finally, in conclusion, the author has given certain recommendations for India. Firstly, the author says that India needs to engage with all the stakeholders in Afghanistan, including Taliban and the regional players like Russia and China. Secondly, India has earned a goodwill cutting across Afghanistan's geography and ethnicities by supporting institution building, infrastructure project, etc. Hence, India should try and harness this goodwill and remain Afghanistan's preferred development partner irrespective of who is in power in Afghanistan. That is, regardless what kind of government comes to Afghanistan, India should continue to remain one of the most preferred development partner of Afghanistan by continuously supporting institution building, infrastructure project, as well as supporting Afghanistan in various multilateral forums. Now, based on our discussion, here is a prelims practice question. Please try and attempt this by pausing the video. We'll discuss the answer after 5 seconds. The question says, with reference to Loya Jirga, which of the following statements are correct? First, it is related with the Pashtun people of Afghanistan. This is correct. Second, its conceptualization is similar to that of Sabha in the Indian subcontinent. This is also right. Hence, the right answer is C, both 1 and 2. With this, let's move on to our next news. The next news appears on page number 14. and is talking about the potential boost to the pharmaceutical sector of India following a rupee pact between India and Iran. From its syllabus, it will form a part of GS Paper 2 in the category of India and its neighbourhood relationship, as well as effect of policies of the developed countries on India's interest. Before understanding about this rupee pact, let us look at the background information of this news. Now, there have been sanctions by the United States on Iran, due to which other countries of the world cannot conduct trade transaction, especially in oil, with Iran in US dollars. That is, now the countries cannot use the US dollars to buy oil from Iran. And therefore, now each country has to come up with an alternative currency arrangement if it wishes to continue its trade transactions with Iran. Hence, in this background, India-Iran too have come out with a rupee pact. So what happens under the rupee pact is that Iran would export oil to India. However, the Indian refineries here will pay Iran for this imported oil not in the currency of Iran but rather in rupees itself. That is, the Indian refiners are paying Iran for the import of oil in Indian rupees. But the problem with this arrangement is that other countries who are trading with Iran are not willing to accept payments in rupees because Indian rupees are not an international currency like the US dollars. Therefore, to solve this problem, India and Iran came out with the rupee real mechanism. Now, under the rupee real mechanism, Iran would use the Indian rupees to pay India for the import of pulses and other commodities. So, earlier in the rupee pact, India was making payment to Iran in rupees, and under the rupee real mechanism, Iran would use these Indian rupees to make payment to India for whatever it is importing for India, which majority of the times are commodities like pulses. But here again the problem was that India currently purchases large amount of oil from Iran, and therefore Iran gets greater reserves of Indian rupees, which is not being fully utilized because Iranian imports from India are very less in quantity. That means Iran has a lot more reserves of Indian rupees than what it can pay back India while it is importing various commodities like pulses. Currently, what happens is that Iran meets its 80% pharmaceutical requirements domestically only, and the other 20% requirement it fulfills by importing pharma from Europe. But now there is a fear that if European Union also puts sanction on Iran or restricts its trade with Iran under US pressure, then it would create problems for import of essential pharma products from Europe. Hence, for India, if this pharma import from Europe stops, then Iran will have to import pharmaceutical products from India under the rupee real mechanism. What it means is that Iran is now looking to increase import of pharmaceutical products from India, and for this, the rupee real mechanism is required, which is already in place between Iran and India. But the only small issue here is that pharmaceutical industry is a very huge industry, which further has a lot of business conglomerates working in this pharmaceutical industry. Hence, India and Iran, under this rupee real mechanism, have to specify as to how trade over multiple pharma products with multiple companies will be handled. So once this technical specification and requirement can be taken care of, India can see an opportunity in Iran to boost and strengthen its pharmaceutical exports. With this, let's move on to our next article. The next news is an article taken from page number 8, in which the author is talking about the human rights condition in India. From its syllabus, it will form a part of GS Paper 2 under the category of Important International Institution. Another thing, it can also become a part of your GS Paper 4 in Ethics under the subcategory of Ethical Issues in International Relations. Let us now understand the basic crux of what the author is trying to say in this article. The author says that due to India's hard power capabilities, especially in the field of economy and military power, India has strengthened its position within the international politics. However, the author feels if India increases its focus on the aspects of human rights, especially within India's foreign policy and relations, then even India's soft power can considerably be increased. Further in this article, the author has tried to assess the human rights environment in our country by taking help of various United Nations independent experts' report. As per these reports, the author says that there has been gross violations of human rights in India, especially in the form of extrajudicial killings, using of torture, violation of freedom of religion, persecution of human rights defenders, deportations of the Rohingya Muslims, etc. Thus, as per the author, it's high time for India to improve its human rights environment by actually taking into consideration all these United Nations independent experts report, which can help India to better assess its position, which will help India to correct its narrative, eventually increasing its soft power in international politics. But now you have to understand one thing about this article. Firstly, it's a very opinion based article. Secondly, the tone of this article is rather negative, which tries to highlight only one aspect of human rights situation in our country. But from a UPSC perspective, we need to have an all-round or rather a much more holistic view about any topic. Therefore, to balance the views given by the author, we will be discussing certain counter-arguments. Now, the first thing which you need to understand is that the Indian government has actually dismissed several of the findings of such special UN reports. The classic example of this would be the report on human rights violation in the Kashmir, which was conducted by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. The reason India gave for rejecting this report was not based on proper research methods and was rather very biased to highlight the specific perspective of Pakistan and Kashmiri separatists. The first counter argument which can be used is that India firstly is world's largest democracy. Secondly, it has its own independent judiciary. And further, India has proper national structures, for example in the form of National Human Rights Commission, to actually take cognizance of human rights violation. Further, the reports which the author has cited, that reports too, use information which has been provided by India's independent media. So what basically this means is that India actually has a robust national structure to deal with violations of human rights in case there are any, and India as a country is not blind towards the situation of human rights. So therefore, if there are violations of human rights in our country, we do have proper systems and structures in place to correct that narrative and improve our human rights situation. Moving ahead, what the author misses here is that in October 2018, India was elected to the United Nations Human Rights Council by highest number of votes ever given to any country. So this would not have been possible if the situation of human rights in India was as grim as is shown by these UN independent reports. Further, you should keep in mind that in her article, the author has dismissed the reports which are given by the Human Rights Council because the author feels that the reports by the Human Rights Council are very biased because it is given out by countries who are actually its members. But the flip side to the author's argument is that though it's correct that the UN independent experts report are based on the findings and observations of group of individuals, but the UNHRC's reports are based on assessment of a group of countries. So therefore, even if these independent expert reports criticize India for such gross violation of human rights, India's soft power amongst these countries cannot be so much affected or cannot be so diminished solely based on the UN independent expert reports. So now what you need to keep in mind is that this explanation provides you with two counter arguments. One being about the national structure to take cognizance of human rights violation in our country, and second, the election of India to the United Nations Human Rights Council. And these two counter arguments become especially important if we look at them in the light of GS paper 4 in ethics within the subsection of ethics in international relations. So based on a discussion of this article, please try and attempt this mains practice question. With this, let's move on to our next news. The next news appears on page number 13 and it talks about that the Government of India has eased norms for angel tax exemption for the startups in India. So let us now understand what exactly is this angel tax. Angel tax is a tax levied on funds raised by Indian startups through issue of shares to the Indian residents. What it means is that when Indian startups issue shares to Indian resident, then the funds which are received from such issuance of shares shall be subjected to a tax which is called as the angel tax. Currently, it is imposed at 30.9% of the tax of the funding received by startup from an external investor. But what you need to keep in mind is that this tax is levied when the startups receive funding at a value higher than its fair market value, under which this extra fund which is received by the startups will be counted as income and therefore subject to be taxed. Let's take an example to understand this. Now, if a company's share are valued at say rupees 100, that is the market value of a company's share is rupees 100, but if it sells these share to an angel investor at rupees 120, then the difference between the two would be rupees 20. So this rupees 20 would be treated as income and not investment, hence will be liable to be taxed by the government. So what you need to keep in mind is that this angel tax is levied on this rupees 20, which is the difference between the fair market value and the price at which the startup sells its share to an angel investor. This angel tax was introduced in the year 2012 so as to keep money laundering at bay. Because what used to happen, people used to just float such kind of companies and then would hoard in black money in the name of an angel investor. Thus, to check that, the government came up with the angel tax. But this angel tax in reality has actually begun to hurt the startup ecosystem in our country. Because the startup ecosystem in India is still very nascent and fragile. That is, it is still at a developing stage. So imposing such kind of tax and notices is rather a discouragement for the investors. So you can understand, already startups face a lot of problem when it comes to funding. Further, if the government imposes such strict rules and regulation, the funding which is already coming in would also go away. Therefore, after this tax, angel investment and funding have fallen by almost 40% in our country. Therefore, a lot of startups have started to receive notices from IT authorities asking them to pay taxes, and a lot of them have also been slapped with penalties on the tax which is not being paid. Thus, all in all, it creates an apprehension that such strict norms for exemption under the angel tax would actually lead to the startup companies shutting down in reality. Therefore, taking in cognizance the concerns of the startups and the investors, the government in May 2018 started to grant certain exemptions from this angel tax to all those genuine investors subject to the fulfillment of certain terms and conditions. That is, to claim exemption from the angel tax, the startups and investors had to make a proper application with all the required documents in a prescribed format to the Department of Industrial Policy and Promotion. But the problem here was that the qualifying criteria for this angel tax exemption itself was very strict and very tedious. Therefore, looking at this cumbersome aspect as well, the government has further eased the angel tax exemption norms. What exactly the government has done to ease these norms, that is the specific requirement, and the technical point is not important from your UPSC perspective, so we will not delve into it because they are very technical and figure related, which UPSC will never ask. But what basically you needed to know from this understand from this topic was what is angel tax. Based on a discussion, here is a prelims practice question. Please pause the video and solve it. We'll discuss the answer after 5 seconds. The question is in relation to angel tax. The first statement, it is tax levied on startup companies, is correct. Second, it is levied on the excess amount at which the shares are sold. This is also right. As we have discussed, it is levied on the difference between the market value of the shares and on the values at which it was sold to the angel investors. Hence, the correct answer becomes C, both 1 and 2. This next news is a snippet appearing on page number 5 and is saying that the archaeologists, while conducting excavations near Talakadu, have unearthed a sandstone idol of a Jain monk in the Kayotsarga pose. So thus, in this article, we will be talking about this Kayotsarga. Kayotsarga means to voluntarily give up one's bodily or physical needs. In Kayotsarga, the Tirthankar is either seated or is in a standing posture and continuously stays steady. Kayotsarga is a form of meditation which can be performed at any time, and the most famous example of the Kayotsarga pose is the statue of Gometeshwara, who is the son of the Rishabdev. Now please try and solve this prelims practice question. We'll discuss the answer after 5 seconds. The question says, the practice of Kayotsarga is practiced in which religion? The right answer is 2, Jainism. With this, we come to an end for today's discussion. Let's move on to the question for the day.